Hello and welcome, friends. In Indian Economy Unit 5 Industrial Policy, up till now we have had a brief overview of what industrial policy is, and we talked about the scope of industrial policy and the various domains which are covered by industrial policy. Today we are going to start our discussion on Industrial Policy 1956. I hope you recall that initially we had Industrial Policy 1948, which was introduced soon after independence, and then we moved over to Industrial Policy 1956. So this is Industrial Policy 1956, and we are going to discuss it today. Now, what happened in Industrial Policy 1956 compared with 1948? The role of public sector enterprises was expanded. So there was increasing responsibility which was given to public sector enterprises compared to what was the case in Industrial Policy 1948, and new categorization of industries was introduced. Earlier in 1948, let me tell you, there were the four categories of industries. So industries were basically categorized into four different categories. Now this system of categorization was changed, and now the categories were reduced to three. And the first category was known as Schedule A, which only had those sectors which were exclusively in public sector enterprises, which were exclusively reserved for public sector enterprises, which means those industries in which no private participation, no private capital was allowed, only public sector enterprises were allowed to function, like arms and ammunition, atomic energy, have a look, shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing. I hope you understand that all of them are very, very important for the strategic autonomy of the country. So strategically speaking, they are very, very important for the economy of a country, and that is why these four industries, for example, were reserved for public sector enterprises. Again, those sectors which are important as far as the infrastructure of the country was concerned, as far as the economy of the country was concerned, like mining, like iron and steel. Now they were very, very important for economic development of the country. Heavy industries, coal you use to generate electricity, iron, steel, so many machinery items, so many construction material is produced using iron, steel, and again we need various metals for so many purposes. So these were important for the economy of the country, crucial to the economy of the country, and that is why these industries were also reserved for public sector play. Then again, have a look, electricity generation, distribution. You would not find any consumer goods industry here, or any FMCG industries here. You would not find, for example, the tobacco manufacturing here or manufacturing of FMCG products here, because they are not vital for the economy of a country. Only those sectors which are very, very important, very, very vital, they were reserved for public sector enterprises. Have a look at the railways, the largest mode of transportation within the country, then air transport, mineral oil. So they were very, very important, and that is why they were exclusively reserved for the public sector enterprises. Then there was Schedule B, the second category, which was to be progressively state-owned, with new undertakings only allowed in public sector. There were 12 industries in Schedule B, and they were to be slowly moved from private sector to the public sector, which meant that no private sector enterprises were allowed to enter these sectors after 1956, and the existing units were also gradually converted into public sector undertakings. Fine. So this was basically Schedule B, and it had basically 12 different sectors. For example, chemicals and chemical pulp, drugs and antibiotics, rubbers, fertilizers, ferroalloys. Ferro means iron. So alloys made up of iron and other metals, road transport and sea transport. Now these were the sectors in which private participation was also now deliberately reduced, and the public participation was increased. So which all units existed till then, they were gradually converted to public sector enterprises, while no new private sector units were allowed to come up in these areas. Now then there was the third category, which you can now understand was reserved exclusively for the private sector enterprises. There was provision of no public sector role in these sectors of economy. So that was basically Schedule C. So now we basically had three categories of industries. One in which there was absolutely public sector dominance, public sector role. There was no role for the private sector whatsoever. The second category was where the role of private sector was to be gradually reduced and the role of public sector enterprises was to be gradually increased. And the third one was which only had private sector contributing. So there was no role which was assigned to public sector enterprises as far as Schedule C sectors were concerned. Now let us talk about the Industrial Policy 1956 provision with respect to the private sector. Now it said that the private sector would be regulated under the Industries Development and Regulation Act of 1951. So there was this particular act, Industries Development Regulation Act, many times known by the acronym IDRA. So this act was passed by the Central Legislature, the Parliament in 1951, and the industries, the private firms were sought to be regulated under this particular act. The licensing regime was also there as far as the provisions of Industrial Policy 1956 is concerned. The licensing regime was there for setting up new units, and this basically came from this particular act only. So if a private sector enterprise wanted to set up a new unit or they wanted to expand their capacity, for example, up till now let us say they are producing only 1 crore matchboxes, for example, and they want to further increase it to 2 crore or 1 crore toothpaste, and they wanted to further increase it to 2 crore. This was an example of capacity expansion, and for that licensing was required. Then in case they wanted to increase the production volume, again they had to obtain license first. They could not have done it on their own without any permission by the government, right? Now what is the difference between capacity expansion and increase in production volume? Now please understand, capacity expansion is, let us say now earlier I used to have one factory and now I want to add 3 more rooms in that particular factory. So this is an example of capacity expansion. But when I start using these 3 rooms to further increase my production volume, then this basically is increase in production volume. Fine. So production volume is basically how much of the capacity you are utilizing. So I may have set up a factory and then I might have expanded it by 25%. I might have expanded the area by 25%. But if I start actually using this extra area to produce the output, then there would be an actual increase in production volume. So there would be utilization of the expanded capacity. Fine. So this is how there is a difference between capacity expansion and increase in production volume. Now it was also promised in the Industrial Policy 1956 that the private sector would be treated at par with the public sector. There would be no discrimination against the private sector enterprises. They would not be discriminated against. The treatment that would be meted out to them would be same as the one which is meted out to public sector enterprises. There would be no 2 different policy frameworks, 2 different sets of rules and regulations for private and public enterprises. Both the kind of enterprises would be treated in a fair manner and they would be given similar treatment. So this was in a way an attempt to assure the private sector enterprise, because it was understood by them that private sector enterprises are also going to play a major role as far as the development of Indian economy is concerned. Then the policy went a step ahead. Not only did they promise fair and equal treatment, but they also said that we would also provide certain facilities to the private sector. For example, we would improve the transport infrastructure. We would ensure that the private sector enterprises have access to continuous power supply. We will also ensure that the private sector enterprises can access finance for their investment requirement, for their capital purchase requirements, capex requirement, capital expenditure requirements. So all these things were promised, and it was said that all these things will ultimately provide an environment which would be conducive for the growth of the private sector, which will encourage and stimulate the growth of private sector enterprises. Now, how do you What do you understand by this particular aspect that I've discussed just now? That improvement in transport infrastructure will improve the prospects of private sector. A 24/7 power supply, regular power supply, consistent power supply would also help the private sector, or access to finance would also help the private sector. See, you know that to expand the business, private sector enterprises required money. So there was this provision regarding access to finance, regarding easing the access of private sector to finance. Then power supply, many of the private sector enterprises, they used to actually work on the power supplies by the government or the government agencies, because at that point of time not many of them had their own sources of power generation. Naturally, if there is a problem with the power supply, the problem might be that the power supply is intermittent. It is not throughout the day. There are power cuts. So naturally, the private sector enterprise would have to suffer, because they would have to stop their assembly lines, would have to stop their production lines, their workers would be idle, their resources would remain idle, and their efficiency would reduce. And that is the reason why power supply infrastructure was also sought to be improved by the government as far as the provisions of Industrial Policy 1956 are concerned. Then transport infrastructure. Naturally, if the transport infrastructure is a good one, the cost of transportation of raw material, the cost of transportation of finished goods would reduce, and this would also further feed into more efficiency of the private sector, higher efficiency of the private sector. And that is why all these things were also promised to the private sector enterprises, just to assure them that a conducive environment would be provided so that they could function efficiently. Another thing which was decided was that the cooperative sectors would also be provided financial assistance. I hope you remember how cooperatives are important for us as far as the Indian economy is concerned. We have discussed this in Unit 3. So it was understood that cooperatives can also help the poorest sections of the society, and they can help improve the living standards of these poorest sections of the society by helping them augment their income. And that is why it was said that the cooperative sector, which basically is part of the private sector because it is not owned by the government or government agencies, so even the cooperatives were to be provided financial assistance. So this was another provision in the industrial policy with respect to private sector. Let's talk about some other features of the industrial policy 1956. The government also said that we would also be encouraging the small scale enterprises, would provide them subsidies. Now subsidy is something that you do not have to return. Subsidy is different from loan. If I take a loan of ₹100, I have to return the loan along with the interest. But if I am given a subsidy on my cylinder, on the household cylinder that the government provides, then naturally I don't have to return that money to the government. So this is how subsidy is different. And the industrial policy said that subsidies would be provided to the small scale enterprises. I hope you recall the importance of small scale enterprises for the economy of the country. We have talked about how they help check rural to urban migration. They bring about more balanced regional economic development, and plus they also provide jobs to a number of people. So government said that would be encouraging small scale enterprises by providing them subsidy by differential taxation. What do we mean by this? Different taxes to different kind of enterprises. While the large scale enterprises producing the same item might have to pay higher taxes, the small scale enterprises were obligated to pay taxes at a much lower rate. So this is what was meant by differential taxation. So this was basically an attempt to encourage the small scale enterprises. So the tax rates which were incident on them were much lower than the large scale enterprises or other kind of industries. And the government also said that they would actively try to expose these small scale enterprises to modern technology. I hope you recall that the small scale enterprises are not able to corner a big chunk of the market. Why? Because many a times their products are qualitatively inferior to the items produced by large scale industries. So they are not able to satisfy the customer and they lose market share. So just to prevent that, it was said that in the small scale enterprises would also be exposed to modern technology. And not only this, the large scale enterprises would not be allowed to produce beyond a particular limit. Now, what is the reason behind that? The idea was that the large scale enterprises would not be allowed to satisfy all the demand in the market. They would only be allowed to satisfy a particular portion of that demand, so that the remaining demand is satisfied by the small scale enterprises. So the large scale enterprises were asked to restrict their production volumes. So there were production caps which were levied on these large scale enterprises, beyond which they could not produce. Alright, you have read about this particular aspect while you were going through business environment, and wherein you have talked about various laws, Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, which is now, of course, has now been replaced by Competition Act. So therein there was a provision that the large scale units cannot produce beyond a particular volume, and if they have to do that, they will have to first of all ask the government for permission. Then the Industrial Policy 1956 also proposed how it would try to develop the backward areas, how to develop the backward areas industrially, how to encourage industries to set up their units in backward areas. So it was said that the licensing conditions would be eased. If a particular firm wants to set up a particular unit in industrial area, in a backward area, then the licensing conditions were relaxed for them. Not only this, many a times they were given subsidies. For example, subsidized power was provided to them. So the government basically said that all those units which come up in backward areas, they would not only be allowed easy licensing, but they would also be provided subsidized power. So this was an attempt to encourage the industries to come up in backward areas, so that there could be balanced regional growth, so that the backward areas could also be developed further. Another aspect which was dealt with in Industrial Policy 1956 is labor amenities. So it was provided for in Industrial Policy 1956 that the businesses will have to incentivize workers, will have to provide them incentives to keep them motivated, and will also have to improve the working conditions. For example, the kind of environment in which they work. For example, if there is a lot of noise because of machines, how can the industrial unit improve the working condition? By providing earplugs to the workers. If there is a lot of humidity, then they can probably install dehumidifiers which reduce the humidity in a particular space, in a particular room, in a particular area. Providing toilets, providing toilet breaks. So these all were part of working conditions, and industrial policy basically stressed on improving the working conditions for the workers. And the reason why this was done was because it was understood that as far as workers and the management is concerned, if the government does not provide the workers any assistance, workers would not be an equal partner as far as their relationship with the management is concerned. The management would always dominate them. So government said that we would be assisting the workers so that they may be equal partners with the management. So that was the whole idea, and that was why there was a provision regarding the labor amenities as well. Then it was also said that the government would try to not only set up, not only start new institutions, but also to strengthen the existing institutions, so that we may have technical and managerial personnel. We may have ready pool of technological and managerial personnel. So we may have people who are technically equipped, who are technically skilled, or who have managerial capabilities. Why? Because these were the skills, technical skills and managerial skills were required for managing the various industries, for supervising the various industries, running the various industries. So government said that we would start more and more institutions to develop such technical and managerial manpower. Again, one more thing which was done was allowing conditional entry of foreign capital and technology. The foreign capital and technology was allowed to come to India, but there was some there were some conditions which had to be met. For example, even if some foreign firm is investing here in India, whatever enterprise they're investing in, the majority ownership of that enterprise had to be with the Indians. Not only the majority ownership, but the majority control, which means most of the management should be in the hands of the Indians. This was an attempt to ensure that the Indian capabilities also develop. Indians also develop the capability of running the various businesses, running the various enterprises. The idea was to reduce dependency on foreign resources and develop domestic resources. So once we have technical and managerial manpower available here in India, we do not have to procure this technical and managerial manpower from outside. So we are not dependent on foreign countries for these resources. Again, if we are running the business on our own, or if we are majority owners of a particular business, then we do not have to worry about development of managerial capabilities in Indians. So the whole idea was to develop such capabilities so that we don't have to remain dependent on the foreign firms and foreign resources, and we can have our own domestic resources. So these were the other features of the Industrial Policy of 1956. With this we come to our discussion on Industrial Policy 1956. We are going to now discuss Industrial Policy 91.